We called it the Pale Journey. Not because it was particularly grand or noble, but because by the end of it, that's how we all looked. Pale, hollow, like we'd been drained of something vital. Proxima Centauri b was supposed to be just another check on humanity's long list of failed hopes. A planet we'd once thought habitable, then abandoned when Earth's priorities shifted back to the mess we'd made at home. But then we found the signal. It wasn't much at first, a faint pulse buried in the static, repeating every 7 hours. Simple, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. The kind of thing you could dismiss as background noise if you weren't paying attention. But someone at the Europa Array had been paying attention. They triangulated it, verified it, and sent it up the chain. Within weeks, funding was secured, a crew assembled, and the Pale Journey became humanity's next big gamble. We were told to expect ruins, a long-dead colony, maybe some relics of the early expansion era. After all, the first wave of settlers had vanished almost 2 centuries ago, and no one had bothered to ask why until now. What we found instead, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. The journey itself was uneventful, boring even. 6 months in cryosleep, 2 weeks of diagnostics and navigation checks, and then the long, slow glide into Proxima's orbit. The planet looked harmless from above, a dim, rocky world with a thin atmosphere and endless stretches of gray terrain. It reminded me of old photographs of the moon, except for the faint greenish glow that seemed to pulse just beneath the surface. No one could explain it. Some kind of bioluminescence, maybe. Or a mineral reaction we didn't understand yet. Either way, it didn't seem dangerous, so we pressed on. The landing was smooth. Almost too smooth for a planet no one had touched in 200 years. That should have been our first clue that something was wrong. We set up camp near the source of the signal. A flat, barren plain with nothing but rocks and dust as far as the eye could see. The signal was louder now, a low, thrumming noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It made your teeth ache if you stood still for too long. The first few days were uneventful. Standard survey work, cataloging the terrain, running atmosphere tests. The air was just barely breathable, though we kept our suits on for safety. Then, on the 4th day, we found the structure. It wasn't much, just a low, dome-shaped building half buried in the ground. The metal was dull and pitted, like it had been exposed to centuries of corrosive winds, but the design was unmistakably human. The kind of prefab shelter they used to drop during the early colonization projects. The door was open. It shouldn't have been. These structures were designed to seal automatically in harsh environments. But this one was just open, like someone had left in a hurry and never come back. We hesitated. Protocol said to proceed with caution, but curiosity got the better of us. Inside, we found nothing. No bodies, no equipment, no sign that anyone had ever lived there. Just a wide, circular room with smooth metallic walls and a single console in the center. The console was still active. Its screen flickered with static, occasionally resolving into lines of garbled text. No one could read it. It wasn't any language we recognized, but the longer we stared at it, the more it felt like the words were moving, shifting, almost like they were trying to rearrange themselves into something we could understand. That's when the door slammed shut. It wasn't loud, more like a soft hiss of air, followed by a click that echoed through the room. We turned, expecting to see one of the team messing with the controls, but there was no one there. Just the 5 of us standing in a circle with nothing but the flickering console and the sound of our own breathing. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the lights began to dim. Not all at once, but gradually, like someone was turning a dial. Shadows stretched across the walls, twisting and curling in ways that didn't make sense. They didn't match our movements. They didn't belong to us. The first thing we did was check the suits. Air levels, comms, emergency beacons, all green, which didn't make sense. The room had sealed, yes, but there was no audible alarm, no drop in pressure, nothing to indicate the environment had changed. Just the dimming lights and those shadows, those wrong shadows, that seemed to shift even when everything else was still. "I don't think we're alone in here," Vasquez muttered. She was closest to the wall, standing stiff as a board, her eyes darting to the edges of the room. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were all thinking the same thing. Keller tried the door. He pulled at it, rammed his shoulder into it, even resorted to the emergency release lever. It didn't budge. "It's jammed," he said, though the way his voice cracked made it clear he didn't believe that. Meanwhile, Morgan, our lead tech, knelt by the console. "This thing is still running," she said, almost to herself. "That's not possible. No power source should last 2 centuries, not without maintenance." She reached out, her fingers hovering just above the flickering screen. "Maybe I can—" "Don't touch it," Vasquez snapped. We all jumped. Vasquez was a pragmatist, never the type to raise her voice or panic, which made her outburst all the more unsettling. She looked at Morgan like she was staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. "We don't know what that thing is." "Exactly," Morgan shot back. "And if we don't figure it out, we're stuck here." She hesitated, then pressed her palm to the screen. Nothing happened, at least not right away. The console hummed softly, its garbled text flickering faster, almost frantic. Then, just as abruptly, it stopped. The screen went dark, and for a brief, blissful moment, we thought the worst of it was over. Then the voices started. They weren't loud, not at first, just a faint murmur, like the sound of a distant crowd filtering through the walls. Keller pressed his helmet's comm. "Command, this is Expedition Alpha," he said. "We're inside the structure, encountering an anomaly, requesting immediate extraction." The static that answered him wasn't the usual crackle of dead air. It was deeper, wetter, like something was moving just beneath the surface of the sound. "No signal," Keller muttered. His hand trembled as he lowered it. The voices grew louder, not yelling exactly, but urgent, overlapping whispers that seemed to come from every direction. They weren't speaking English, or any language we knew, but there was a cadence to them, a rhythm that felt almost familiar, like the way a lullaby feels even when you can't remember the words. And then the whispers stopped. Just like that, the room was silent again. Except now, something had changed. The shadows. They were still there, curling along the walls like smoke, but now they weren't just shapes. They had depth, texture, subtle, rippling movements that made your stomach lurch if you looked too closely. One by one, we turned off our helmet lights. It didn't help. The shadows were still there, darker than the rest of the room, like they were carved out of something that light couldn't touch. "I don't like this," Vasquez said, her voice barely above a whisper. No one argued. Morgan was the first to notice the smell. It came on so faintly that we almost didn't register it at first. A sharp, metallic tang, like rusted iron. But then it grew stronger, more acrid, until it filled our helmets, seeping through filters that should have blocked everything. "That's not possible," Keller said, coughing. No one answered. The console screen flickered back to life, its text clearer now, though still unreadable. This time, though, it wasn't just random symbols. There was a pattern to it. Lines of text arranged in neat, deliberate rows, each one pulsing in time with the faint thrumming sound that filled the air. "I think it's communicating," Morgan said. She sounded almost awed, like a scientist who's just made the discovery of a lifetime. "No," Vasquez said. "It's baiting us." Before anyone could respond, the thrumming sound grew louder, more insistent. The shadows on the walls stretched, lengthening into impossibly tall shapes that seemed to lean toward us. And then, for the first time, one of them moved. Not just the vague, rippling motion we'd seen before, but a deliberate, purposeful step. It peeled itself away from the wall, its edges shimmering like heat waves, and began to cross the room. It didn't walk. It glided, soundless, leaving no trace behind. And though it had no face, no eyes, we knew it was looking at us. None of us moved. None of us dared to breathe. The shape stopped just in front of the console, its outline flickering like a bad transmission. For a moment, it seemed to hesitate. Then it reached out, if you could call it that, and pressed something that wasn't quite a hand against the screen. The console let out a high-pitched whine. The shadows around the room pulsed once, twice, then dissolved, leaving only the one shape in front of us. Then the screen showed a single word. One we could all understand. Run. We didn't need to be told twice. Keller was the first to move, slamming his fist against the emergency release lever again. This time, the door hissed open with a reluctant groan, like whatever was holding it shut had decided to let us go. We bolted out into the cold, gray landscape, our boots kicking up clouds of dust as we ran. But even as we put distance between ourselves and that structure, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't actually escaped. The thrumming noise was still there, faint but constant, vibrating deep in my chest. It wasn't coming from the structure anymore. It was coming from the ground beneath us, like the entire planet was resonating with it. "What the hell was that thing?" Vasquez demanded, her voice trembling despite the anger in her tone. No one answered, not because we didn't have theories, but because none of us wanted to speak them out loud. The colony site was a mile east of the structure, marked by a series of rusted metal pylons jutting out of the ground like broken teeth. It wasn't much, just a cluster of derelict buildings and the remains of what might have been solar panels. But it was shelter, and right now, that was all we cared about. The buildings were in worse shape than the structure. Most of them had collapsed entirely, their walls buckled and roofs caved in. The largest one, a squat, rectangular block with faded markings on its side, was still mostly intact. We headed for it, moving as quickly as the thin air and our pounding hearts would allow. Inside, the air was stale but breathable. We sealed the door behind us, propped it up with a metal beam we'd scavenged from the rubble, and collapsed against the walls. For the first time in what felt like hours, we let ourselves breathe. "What now?" Keller asked. He was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, his helmet cradled in his hands. "We can't go back to the ship, not with that thing out there." "We're not staying here," Vasquez said. "We keep moving. There's got to be another way off this planet." "And go where?" Morgan shot back. "We don't even know what we're dealing with." The argument was cut short by a sudden noise, a sharp, metallic scraping sound that seemed to come from the far side of the room. We froze, our heads snapping toward the source. At first, we thought it was just the wind. Then we saw the marks. They were faint, barely visible against the dusty floor, but unmistakable. Long, thin scratches, like claw marks, leading from the doorway to the far wall. They hadn't been there when we came in. Keller swore under his breath. "What the hell is—" "Quiet," Vasquez hissed. We held our breath, straining to hear over the pounding of our own hearts. The room was silent. Too silent. Then, faintly, we heard it. A low, guttural sound, almost like breathing coming from just beyond the wall. It didn't sound human. Morgan scrambled to her feet, backing away from the wall as the breathing grew louder, more ragged. "It's inside," she whispered. "No," Vasquez said, her voice tight. "It's underneath." The floor beneath us began to tremble, just slightly at first, then more violently. Dust rained down from the ceiling as the ground seemed to ripple like something massive was moving beneath the surface. We didn't wait to find out what it was. The door barely held as we shoved it open and stumbled out into the open air. Behind us, the building groaned, its walls buckling as the tremors grew stronger. Then, with a deafening crack, the entire structure collapsed, sending up a cloud of dust and debris that swallowed everything in its path. We ran blindly, coughing and choking on the dust until we reached the edge of the colony site. When we finally stopped, gasping for air, we turned back to see the rubble settling in the distance. And then we saw it. The ground where the building had stood was sinking, collapsing inward like a massive sinkhole. And from the center of it, something was rising. At first, it was hard to make out, a dark, amorphous shape, slick and glistening in the dim light. But as it emerged, we could see it wasn't a single entity. It was made up of smaller shapes, writhing and twisting together, their surfaces shimmering like oil on water. It didn't make a sound. It didn't need to. The way it moved, the way it seemed to absorb the light around it, was enough to send a cold, primal fear coursing through us. "Back to the structure," Keller said, his voice barely audible. "We have to go back." "No," Vasquez said. "We keep moving. Away from it. Away from all of this." The ground beneath our feet began to tremble again, and we didn't wait to argue. We ran, the thrumming noise growing louder with each step, like a heartbeat that wasn't ours. And in the distance, beyond the colony site, we saw more of those shapes rising from the ground. We didn't stop running until the colony site was a smudge on the horizon, and even then, it didn't feel far enough. The shapes, whatever they were, weren't chasing us, not directly, but they didn't need to. The ground beneath our boots pulsed with that same rhythmic thrum, like the entire planet was alive and aware of us. We were being herded. No one said it out loud, but you could see it in the way we moved, in the way Vasquez kept scanning the horizon, her rifle raised, even though we all knew it wouldn't do any good. The terrain grew rougher as we pushed on, the smooth plains giving way to jagged outcroppings of black rock. The greenish glow beneath the surface was brighter here, seeping through cracks in the ground like veins of molten glass. It cast eerie, shifting shadows that made it impossible to tell where the rocks ended and the darkness began. "We need a plan," Keller said, his voice hoarse. "We stick to the high ground," Vasquez replied, not looking back. "Stay out of the open. Keep moving until—" "Until what?" Morgan interrupted. "Until we run out of air? Until this thing decides to finish us off? We don't even know what it is. What if—" "Enough," Vasquez snapped, spinning around to face her. The argument died on her lips. Morgan was staring past her, her face pale, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that can't be faked. Slowly, we turned to see what she was looking at. There was a figure standing on the ridge above us. At first, we thought it was one of the shapes, but it didn't have that same wrongness to it. It looked human. Too human. The figure was tall and thin, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. It wore what might have once been a colonist's jumpsuit, though it was faded and torn, the fabric clinging to its gaunt frame like it had grown into its flesh. Its face was the worst part. It wasn't just pale. It was blank, smooth, featureless, like someone had erased it. But it was facing us. We could feel it, even without eyes or a mouth, an unbearable weight, like we were being watched by something that shouldn't exist. For a long moment, none of us moved. Then the figure raised one skeletal arm, its movements slow and deliberate, and pointed to the west. "No," Keller whispered. "No way." The figure tilted its head as if considering him, and then it turned and began to walk. No, glide, along the ridge, heading in the direction it had pointed. It didn't look back. It didn't need to. "Do we follow it?" Morgan asked, her voice trembling. "No," Vasquez said firmly. "It's leading us into a trap." "And if it's not," Keller countered, "if it's the only way out of this—" The ground beneath us shuddered, the tremors growing stronger with each passing second. The glow beneath the surface flared, brighter and hotter than ever before. "We don't have a choice," Morgan said, already moving to follow the figure. Vasquez swore under her breath but didn't stop her. None of us did. The figure led us through the jagged terrain, its movements unnervingly smooth, never faltering even as the ground cracked and shifted beneath it. We followed at a distance, too afraid to get close but too desperate to turn back. The air grew heavier as we walked, each breath coming harder than the last. Our suit filters whined in protest, struggling to keep up, but the smell, sharp and metallic like burning wires, only grew stronger. And then we saw it. A chasm, wide and impossibly deep, splitting the ground in two. The green glow was brightest here, pouring out of the cracks like liquid fire. The figure stopped at the edge of the chasm, turning to face us once more. It raised both arms, pointing to the void below. "What the hell is this?" Keller asked, his voice rising. "You want us to jump?" The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, silent and still, its blank face staring at us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The ground shook violently, and somewhere in the distance we heard a sound, a deep, resonant roar that didn't belong to anything we could imagine. "We don't have time for this," Morgan said, stepping closer to the edge. "If we stay here, we're dead." "Or worse," Vasquez muttered. The roar grew louder, closer, and with it came the shadows. They poured over the ridge like a tidal wave, faster than anything we'd seen before, their shapes twisting and writhing in impossible ways. "Go!" Vasquez shouted, shoving Morgan toward the edge. "Go now!" One by one, we jumped. The fall wasn't like falling. It was slow, almost gentle, as if the air itself had thickened to catch us. The glow surrounded us, swallowing us whole, and for a moment there was nothing but light and the sound of our own breathing. Then we hit the ground. Or at least we thought it was the ground. It didn't feel solid, more like standing on the surface of a frozen lake, with something dark and shifting just beneath your feet. The glow faded, and we found ourselves in a vast, open chamber. The walls were smooth and curved, their surfaces glistening with the same oily shimmer as the shapes above, and in the center of the chamber, something was waiting for us. The chamber was silent, but not the kind of silence that comforts. This was the silence of something holding its breath, watching, waiting. We didn't speak, didn't dare move. The thing in the center of the room had no clear form, no edges or structure our minds could fully grasp. It shimmered, constantly shifting, like liquid caught in the throes of indecision. Colors bled and twisted within it, blues and greens and blacks that shouldn't have existed together, that made your head ache if you stared too long. It wasn't just there, it was part of the space, part of us, like the air we were breathing was feeding it. I was the first to break the silence, though I didn't mean to. "What? Is it?" My voice sounded wrong, distorted, like it had passed through a filter I couldn't see. No one answered. Keller took a hesitant step forward and the thing reacted. Not violently, not suddenly. It didn't lash out or move toward him. It simply shifted, a ripple moving through it like a shiver, and the glow around us dimmed. Then the voices began. They weren't coming from the thing, not directly. They were inside us, overlapping whispers threading through our thoughts. It wasn't just words. It was memories, fragments of things we hadn't thought about in years, surfacing all at once. My mother's voice calling my name when I was a child, the laughter of friends I hadn't seen since leaving Earth, the sound of my own voice screaming in fear. The whispers weren't random. They were pulling, searching, digging deeper with every passing second. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. "Stop!" Vasquez shouted, but her voice was thin, powerless. She stumbled back, her weapon slipping from her grip. "It's in my head. I can't." The thing rippled again, and Keller fell to his knees, clutching his chest. "It's feeding," he gasped. "It's learning." That's when I realized what it was doing. It wasn't trying to hurt us, at least not in a way we could understand. It was consuming us, breaking us down piece by piece, not physically but mentally, emotionally. It wasn't a predator. It was a mirror, reflecting back everything we were, everything we'd ever been, and stripping it away until there was nothing left. The ground beneath us began to shift, trembling with that same pulsing rhythm that had followed us since we arrived. The walls of the chamber seemed to close in, the oily shimmer creeping closer. Morgan was the first to crack. She stumbled forward, reaching out toward the thing as if drawn to it. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No!" Vasquez shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her back. "Don't touch it." But it was too late. The moment Morgan's fingers brushed the surface, the whispers stopped. For a second, the chamber was completely still. Then the thing exploded outward, a wave of color and sound that knocked us off our feet. When the light faded, Morgan was gone. Not just gone, erased. There was no trace of her, not even her shadow. "What the hell?" Keller whispered, scrambling back. The thing had changed. It was larger now, its movements more deliberate. The colors within it had grown darker, more vibrant, and the air around it felt heavier, like it was pressing down on us. "It took her," Vasquez said, her voice hollow. "It took her." "No," I said, struggling to find my voice. "She's still here, somewhere. It's keeping her." The thing pulsed, and I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. It wasn't just keeping her. It was using her, adding her to itself like she was fuel for whatever it was becoming. "We have to get out of here," Keller said, his voice frantic. "And go where?" Vasquez shot back. "There's no way out. There's nothing but—" The chamber shuddered violently, cutting her off. The glow beneath the surface flared and the oily shimmer began to rise, forming shapes that looked almost human, but not quite. They moved jerkily, their limbs bending in ways that made my stomach churn. "They're us," Keller said, his voice barely above a whisper. He was right. The shapes had our faces, our movements, but they were wrong. Hollow, like someone had built replicas of us without understanding what it meant to be alive. The thing pulsed again, and the shapes turned toward us. "We need to move," Vasquez said, pulling me to my feet. "Where?" I asked, but I didn't wait for an answer. We ran, dodging between the rising shapes as the chamber collapsed around us. The light grew brighter, hotter, until it felt like it was burning through my suit. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic, overlapping until they were a roar. We reached the edge of the chamber, but there was no exit. Just a wall of shimmering light that seemed to stretch infinitely. Behind us, the shapes were closing in, their movements growing more coordinated, more deliberate. "This is it," Keller said, his voice shaking. "No," Vasquez said, gripping her rifle tightly. "This isn't how it ends." She fired into the light, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. For a moment, the light flickered, revealing a faint outline of a passage beyond it. "Go!" she shouted, shoving us forward. We dove through the opening, the light searing against our skin. When we emerged, the air was cold, sharp, and painfully real. We were back on the surface, but the landscape had changed. The plains were gone, replaced by an endless expanse of black, jagged rock. The sky was darker, the stars twisted and wrong. The thrumming noise was gone, but in its place was something worse. Silence. Vasquez didn't make it out. We stood there, gasping for breath, staring at the alien landscape that stretched out before us. "We're not getting off this planet," Keller said finally, his voice hollow. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Because in the distance I could see the shapes rising again. Their movements slow and deliberate, like they had all the time in the world, and I knew they weren't coming for us. They were waiting,